In 1976, the Men's Club of the Methodist Church commissioned the painting of some signs that were put up in the village that summer. This one lists some of the important dates in the development of the community. Beaver Falls is a small village of some 400 souls, according to the 1980 census, cut in two by the Beaver River, with the north side lying in the town of Croghan, and the south is in the town of New Bremen. Some people might wonder how such a small place could have history worth mentioning. But as we shall see, several important events originated here. So let's go back to the beginning. 13 years after Cornwallis surrendered to General Washington, ending the Revolutionary War, the first white men explored the Beaver River and the site, which many years later was to become Beaver Falls. Simon Desjardins and Peter Farreau, agents of the French Casterland Company, came to America to explore and develop the company's land purchase of 210,000 acres called Casterland in our present Lewis and Jefferson County. The project was inaugurated to escape the atrocities of the French Revolution in Paris. Their constitution required that two cities be located on the tract, one inland and one on the lake. In 1794, the year after their arrival in this country, they explored the Beaver River and found it to have excellent power sites, so decided to locate their city of Casterville here, where Beaver Falls now stands. In 1795, Farreau, chief architect of the project, drowned at the Great Falls, now known as Watertown. This loss marked the beginning of the end of the whole project. Desjardins took over leadership and was eventually replaced by Rudolph Tillier, who managed to get some work done. A road was built from the establishment at High Falls, Lyons Falls, to Casterville. Some buildings were erected at the bend in the river below town, and in 1798 a sawmill was built on the north bank, where the Lefevre tannery was built years later. There were many hardships and obstacles, as well as charges of mismanagement, so that by 1800 the project came to a halt. And in the meantime, the French government had pardoned the émigrés, so most returned to France. Nature reclaimed the land, but the name Casterville remained on the early maps of the county and state. James Leray was a commissioner of the Casterland Company and eventually became the owner of the tract, and 25 or 30 years elapsed before anyone returned to this place. Leray advertised his land well in Europe, and by the 1830s and 40s, Swiss and German families began to settle in the townships of Croghan and New Bremen. The first to come back to the old site of Casterville were Jacob and Rudolph Rohr, who built a sawmill. The little cluster of mill and houses became known as Rohr's Mills. Sawing lumber was big business in those early days of clearing land. Aaron Foote came up from Northville and built a mill on the south side of the river, just below the bridge. That mill changed hands several times. In 1857, it was owned by James Prince, and by 1870, Norcross and Saunders were running it. It was finally purchased by T.B. Baslin, the lumber baron. Farther down the river, Jacob Steinhilber, farmer and contractor, built a mill. His mill, rebuilt after the fire, was also bought by Baslin. To get his lumber from the upper mill to his canal boat landing, he built a railroad to the landing across from the town of Croken Garage. It was first used in July of 1881. Hiram Lewis, a Northville farmer, had seen the tanning process at Isaac Lefevre's tannery at Parkville, just outside of Northville. Hiram decided he wanted to get into that business and locate where the supply of hemlock was ample. His old friend Aaron Foote told him about Rohr's Mills, so in 1851 Hiram hitched up his horse and buggy and with his daughter Celestia drove up here to investigate. He liked what he saw and built a tannery. In his younger days, he had been a captain in a local military unit, and this was his gun. This old muzzle loader was charged through the end of the muzzle, and the tamped down with a ramrod, and a percussion cap was put in a little groove here in the trigger. This little thing had a opening down through the center, so when the trigger was fired, a spark went down through and ignited the powder. And there was a storage space here for extra caps. This trigger guard is of a more recent addition, but otherwise it's the original gun. He also had a sword, which I imagine was used for dress purposes. It used to be in a leather scabbard, but that has deteriorated with time. In 1852, he built a log schoolhouse about where the firehouse stands, and the first teacher was his 16-year-old daughter Celestia. His family, which included a young son, James P., had joined him the previous year. But Hiram's health failed, and after selling the tannery to William C. Lefevre, he returned to Northville, where he died in 1857. William C. ran the tannery from 1856 until 1864, when he sold to Martin Lefevre, who had been the foreman in his father's tannery. He had a beam knife that was used in the tannery to cut the hides. The beam tables were curved on top, and a knife was used to cut up through and do any trimming. This came from the Lefevre tannery, this old knife. When his father died, James P. Lewis, a boy of 12, left school to run the family farm. At a foundry over a 5-year period, he learned the machinist trade, and in 1871 married Julia Slocum. They decided to sell the farm and return to Beaverton, the name then used for the community. He was employed by the tannery as an agent for 10 years. By 1880, the supply of hemlock bark was about exhausted, and the sawing business was on the wane. The prospects were not bright for Beaver Falls, the official name after the post office was established in 1866. In 1881, in order to assure some future industry, M.R. Lefevre, J.P. Lewis, and Charles Newfer organized the Beaver Falls Pulp Company. Now, the manufacture of pulp for making paper was a comparatively new business. Rags had always been used. That pioneering mill and dam were built by Mr. Newfer at the eastern end of the present Lower Mill. And on January the 19th, 1882, the first sheet of pulp was made. They made pulp until 1886, when financial trouble caused the partnership to be dissolved. J.P. Lewis became the owner, and he proceeded to make changes in the machinery to produce a better product, thus putting the mill on a paying basis. Revolutionary changes in machine design were taking place, and Mr. Newfer and Mr. Lewis investigated a new hydraulic grinder, but built another pulp mill. In 1887, farther up the river, he installed the new type grinders, thus making it the second mill in the United States using hydraulic process. The fact that pulp from two mills was being exported led to the building of a paper mill. J.N. Slocum joined his brother-in-law, J.P. Lewis, to build the Lewis and Slocum paper mill in 1889. That was on the site of the latex mill. They turned out pulpboard and building paper and employed about 30 men and 5 teams. The paper business expanded, so that in 1892, J.P. Lewis went down to the site of the first pulp mill and put up another paper mill. The J.P. Lewis Company manufactured wood pulp, waterproof building paper, and moth-proof carpet paper. The mill burned in 1898 and was immediately rebuilt. In 1892, paper matches were invented in Pennsylvania, and the first ones were made by the Diamond Match Company. But the paper was not satisfactory. It had to char and not burn. J.P. experimented in the kitchen of his home with solutions until he came upon the right mixture, then contacted the Diamond Match Company. A trial run was made with some yellow thrown in the beater to give it more of a wood color. The company got the order, installed the number 2 machine, and made yellow book match paper for years. The J.P. Lewis Company had been pasting sheets together to form a heavy board for picture framing business. They made some large panels, and the idea formed to use them to cover walls to replace plaster. J.P. covered the walls of his billiard room with the panels, which were then decorated. And the experiment was a success which marked the birth of the wallboard industry. Paper was shipped to a newly formed Beaver manufacturing company in Buffalo for processing. This is a little watch fob advertising piece. It has the Beaver board logo on the front, and on the back there's a sales message. Years ago, men had a watch pocket in their trousers about here, and this was attached to the stem so it could be pulled out easily. To ensure a constant supply of wood, extensive lumbering operations were needed. Lumber camps with horses and equipment and lumberjacks had to be maintained. The log drivers drove the logs down the Beaver River to the mills. A huge horse barn was built here to care for the animals. J.P. Lewis died in 1912.